Kia ora, welcome to our Techweek panel on accessibility, inclusion and digital experiences. Thank you for joining us. My name is Ella and I'm Digital Marketing Specialist at Springload. I'll be hosting today's session. I've got Emilia Zapata, Jason Kiss, Ruth Hendry and Meena Kadri with me today. First, I'd like to run through what to expect during the session. Captions are available. You can turn them on by navigating to the bottom right of your screen and you can see 3 vertical dots which you can click, and there should be a turn on captions option available. You can also change how you view this webinar on that menu as well. We're also recording this session and we'll be publishing it with a transcript on YouTube after the event. Only the speakers will be visible in the recording, but to everyone watching, please could you turn off your video and your microphone for the session too. We'll start with introductions and then we'll move on to the panel discussion, where we'll also address some of the questions that you asked during your ticket submissions. We also encourage questions throughout via the chat function. And my colleague Kelly will be monitoring this, and we will address these at the end with a Q&A section. So let's start with introductions. Amelia.
Hello everyone, so the name's Emilia. I'm a front-end developer at Springload. I also happen to be a queer woman and disabled, and that influences the way I work a lot, especially concerning the topic we're currently focusing on. And yeah, that's me.
Thanks, Amelia. Jason?
Hi, I'm Jason Kiss. I'm Principal Advisor in Accessibility for the Department of Internal Affairs, where I help lead the all of government web standards, one of which is the Web Accessibility Standard, obviously focused on making sure government content online is accessible to all users, including disabled users.
Thanks. And Ruth?
Kia ora koutou, ko Ruth Hendry. I'm the content director here at Springload, which means that I help our clients create inclusive and accessible content that works for people and for their businesses as well. So one of the things I'm really passionate about is that none of our products should leave anyone out.
Oh. And Meena?
Kia ora tātou. I'm interested in the intersection of innovation, culture and social change. I've got a background in anthropology and design, and I did a decent stint with global innovation agency IDEO across a range of digital startups focusing on community engagement. These days I'm consulting in New Zealand and including with good folks at Springload.
Oh, thank you. Thanks for all those introductions. I'd like to say a quick word about Springload before we jump into the discussion. We are an independent digital agency based in Wellington. We research, design and build digital products and experiences that enable change for good. Our clients include Te Papa, CLIM and government agencies, including the Ministry of Education, ACC and DIA, where Jason is Principal Advisor in Accessibility. Over the past few months, we've been focusing on updating the Springload website to make it more accessible, and that's what's prompted us to focus on accessibility, inclusion and digital experiences today. So that brings me to kind of my first point. What does accessibility and inclusion mean to you? And I'd start with Jason.
Sure. In terms of just defining those terms, for me, I think about accessibility rather simply as an outcome or a characteristic of some product or service, something, which basically means it's usable by disabled people. For me, that's what accessibility means. It's a subset of usability, if you will, for disabled people. Inclusion is much broader. It's for me, it's a concept around just making sure that all individuals are able to participate as they are enabled to participate, to share their perspectives, to contribute their points of view in a way that allows them to do that independently, with dignity, and regardless of particular characteristics, their setting, the other tools they might be using. So it's a broader concept, sort of associated with inclusive design or universal design, which again is a methodology for achieving certain outcomes, one of which is accessibility for disabled people.
Thanks for that. So does anyone else have anything else they'd like to add in what that means for them?
Yeah, I two main questions that I'd be asking either of myself or of designing for, or that I'd be thinking in terms of them would be, do I feel welcome and able to participate? And do I feel like I belong here?
Yeah, building on what Meena said there, for me, inclusion also means, do I understand what I'm participating in? Can I participate in this thing equitably? And sometimes those issues are systemic that might need to be actually addressed as part of the digital product. And are there options for me as a participant to participate in another way, non-digitally? So, for example, for those people who provide healthcare information, are there ways for people to access it in the way they want to? And that might be digitally, or it might be in a physical format, for example, in a doctor's office. And another good example is, I know that Plunket, so for those of you who don't know, Plunket is a charity that's Aotearoa's biggest support service for tamariki under fives, something which I'm quite passionate about because I've got a 4-year-old and a 2-year-old. They're looking for ways to make their content more accessible. And some of the ways they're thinking about doing that is, for example, if you're breastfeeding or you're holding their baby, people want you to be able to ring them, use a voice search, use a chatbot, as well as the kind of holding the baby, one finger typing that people do. So Plunket there are considering the situational accessibility issues that people might have, as well as the more permanent accessibility issues. In my opinion, in terms of participation, they just know the role of men in caring for young children, but that's a different inclusion issue for them to consider later.
Great examples, Ruth. Emilia?
To me, I tend to think of inclusion as not excluding people and being careful about my intent and the result of that intent, because it's often really easy to have a certain intent but have a very different impact. I don't think people are making things inaccessible because they want it to be inaccessible, but the impact is still there. And so, to paraphrase someone way smarter than me, intent does not erase impact. And that's something that's very, very much at the core of diverse inclusion and accessibility to me, is making sure that my impact is not affecting anyone negatively.
That's a really great point, and I think you've all touched on things where we can be asking ourselves in our everyday work. And I think as well with those examples that you provided, Ruth, and thinking about how we're moving very quickly to make sure everything is online, especially after lockdown, we might be moving too fast, and there might be some people being left out in those situations. So kind of like moving on to my next point, especially I'm sure there might be some people watching thinking about how they can include accessibility and inclusion in their work, especially now that we are moving online. At what point should people consider accessibility and inclusion in their work?
I think it's important to acknowledge that it should be part of all processes, because if we don't think about everyone at every step, we risk losing people along the way. And so I think it's a cross-discipline concern, as in design has to be aware of it, and development has to be aware of it, content has to be aware of it. And it's often making sure that we keep an open discussion to get these things resolved and actually addressed. That means making sure that everyone is safe to raise any issues, making sure that everyone can actually make a change in the right direction.
Yeah, and I think that drawing on what Emilia is saying, ideally it's at the start of a project when you're creating the principles for a project, so that they're embedded into what is guiding that project, rather than just being check boxes that you've got at some end point of the project.
I really liked Emilia's point there about having a team that facilitates open discussions and a place that's safe to raise issues. That's vital for accessibility and for other issues. And of course, it is better to consider accessibility and inclusion right from the start. It's better for the people who are using it, it's better for businesses, it's often more cost effective. But for many people, and that sometimes includes Springload, probably some of the people who are on this panel at the moment, some of us aren't always in a position to affect change from the start. Sometimes a product might already be live, and it's never too late to make improvements. And that's the beauty of digital, I suppose. It's not an all or nothing game. So if that's the case for me, the things I'm thinking about are, what does the audience need? What's of most benefit to them? And how can we best help them? And so, for example, that might be things like including captions on videos, so better for hearing impaired viewers, and also better for commuters as well. And there's also considerations around language, like, for example, iteratively improving te reo Māori content, so focusing on content that's meaningful to an audience who's fluent in te reo Māori. And Te Papa have done a really good job of that, I think, lately over the past 5 or 7 years. I was having a poke around their site with one of my kids and saw their videos called He Paki Taonga ia Māui. So they're stories for tamariki and te reo Māori, which they've added to iteratively over time. And that's the kind of content you can build on and improve.
Nice. And I think in an ideal world, we would all like to be building and kind of baking everything we do with accessibility and inclusion. But definitely speaking from, experience and working at Springload, and we've been working on our own accessibility, and sometimes it is something that might need to be done at a later stage. Jason, is there anything you'd like to add?
Well, I guess I agree that obviously I think everyone's on the same page in terms of understanding that accessibility, inclusion, those types of considerations, alongside considerations around security and privacy, for example, and general usability, all of those need to be considered from the very earliest stages and throughout as one iterates through a project. That's the ideal. In the case that doesn't happen, what can we do? Certainly, if you haven't considered accessibility and then you've launched a product or service and then you're stuck at that stage with a live product or service, having to go back and remediate for, say, conforming to the Web Content Accessibility Guidelines, the International Accessibility Standard, it seems really daunting. Nobody really has the budget or the appetite to sort of do that at that point, even if it's formally required or even legally required in some instances. But it's true that the iterative nature of digital makes this a goal that we can set for the future, and we can just take it bit by bit as we go. It may not be at that stage that setting a goal of complete WCAG conformance is reasonable. Maybe you want to focus on some top issues that are high impact for disabled users, for example. Maybe it's captions, lack of captions for videos if you use a lot of video. If you use a lot of images or graphs or charts, maybe it's long descriptions. Maybe it's just proper semantic HTML. so that people who use assistive technologies like screen readers can get the same information about the structure of the content on the page. So I think one can be practical about it and identify some quick, high-impact goals to start tackling iteratively, and then just keep expanding that as you reach those goals. Add some new ones so that eventually you are as accessible as you can be. But I think being practical about it is probably the most important bit.
I just wanted to add something else about sort of experience from online communities, because with some online communities that I've worked with, we've actually been able to co-cultivate quite a strong sense of collaboration within the community. And that means that they will often step up to design for inclusivity themselves. So we had an Open IDEO member who invited community members from across the community, which I think was about 60,000 people at that stage, to form a collaborative translation group to translate parts of a project from English into other languages. So that kind of speaks to the strength that you can cultivate within an online community.
Nice. Yeah, so kind of setting actionable points and actionable goals to reach, and getting people on board with that, and being transparent and sharing sounds like great tips. And I just want to go back to Jason, you mentioned about kind of whether it's like a legal requirement or not. And I think this ties into a question that was asked during booking, which is, at present, only government agencies are required to meet the New Zealand web standards. What is being done to spread awareness and encourage digital accessibility in the private sector? Would anyone like to answer that?
Well, I can give it a go. I mean, it's certainly true that the New Zealand government web accessibility standard is mandated by Cabinet only for the public service departments, the main core government agencies, of which there are about, the number changes every year, but it's between 30 and 40. It's the core departments. And that's an internal government directive from Cabinet. But the point of that Cabinet directive was to give effect to the human rights legislation that exists, and all organizations, whether public or private, are bound by the Human Rights Act, which prohibits discrimination in the delivery of goods and services on the basis of a disability, among other characteristics, protected characteristics. And so, in some sense, nobody is allowed to discriminate. Nobody is allowed to put up public-facing or to deliver goods and services in a private sector context online that's not accessible. So there's already a requirement there, but there's no formal obligation that says you need to meet the web content accessibility guidelines, or you have to meet this or that standard. That is possibly changing, given that the Ministry of Social Development is currently involved with a work program looking at new accessibility legislation for New Zealand. And that would establish ideally it would establish more formal regulatory mechanisms, making it clear that private sector and public sector organizations need to make their all of their products and services, their physical environments, their online environments, all of those would need to be accessible in some way, shape, or form, however that ends up being defined. And so we could see in 3 to 5 years more direct requirements or obligations on private sector companies, in addition to public sector, for delivering accessible products and services.
So now is a good time to start setting those actionable goals.
Correct.
In 5 years' time, we'll be, smashing it.
Right.
Thank you. Thanks for giving that a go. Would anyone else like to add anything to that point?
There's a precedent in the US with the ADA not explicitly requiring websites to be accessible, but recently Domino's was basically condemned for not making their website accessible on the basis that the ADA required them to do so. And so while there's no explicit legislation there as well, they created a legal precedent, which means that websites actually do have to adhere to certain guidelines. And maybe we're just one lawsuit away from doing that here as well.
I think as well, regardless of if it's legal or not, one of the good things about having communities online is that people do share their experiences and call people out and call companies out when they're not accessible or inclusive. So even though if it's not a legal requirement, it's something that more and more companies are facing, especially with this public voice holding them to account. And this kind of goes on to one of the next points. Sometimes when we're proposing accessibility work, you might hear someone say accessibility and inclusion is expensive and time consuming as a kind of a reason not to do it, or a barrier. And I'd like to know kind of what your responses would be if someone said that to you.
It goes back to what we said earlier. Yes, accessibility is going to cost you if you didn't factor it in from the get-go, because you have made decisions along the way that you'll have to walk back. You'll have to repair what has been broken, and that's the sort of thing that's going to cost money. But businesses as a whole do have a vested interest in making things accessible as well, because disabilities don't mean we stop being humans. It doesn't mean we stop consuming. It doesn't mean we stop buying stuff online, etc. So making sure that you include everyone is actually increasing your ROI as well. There were a few studies showing that depending on the scale of your website, 1% increase in sales can be a lot of money, and money that could be directly injected into making things more accessible as well. And you'd still have plenty of money left. So yeah, I guess it can depend on where your business sits, but there is always something to gain out of making things accessible that are not necessarily quantifiable with money directly, but can have a positive impact on a business revenue.
There's a great study out of the UK called the Click Away Pound survey. I think it's actually been done a couple of times now. And it basically documents that behavior of disabled people when they go to a website that's selling things that isn't accessible. They click away, they go away, and they don't spend their pound there, right? And this is an attempt to provide a business case for accessibility, just along the lines of what Emilia was saying. Basically, just lost market revenues when you don't consider that percentage of the population that could be spending money on your site. But that click away pound survey is really well researched and provides some really strong documentation along that argument that businesses are losing money by not catering to disabled people who have lots and lots of money to spend.
Yeah, and I guess that sometimes it's about if it's an e-commerce site, it is actually about transactional money, but it's also having that discussion with your clients that outlines the strategic direction of a project. So what are the outcomes that you're pursuing? So if you're pursuing health outcomes, if people can't use your system, your digital system or any system, you won't meet those health outcomes. So I think when it comes to digital, you need to not confuse the vehicle with the destination. Digital is the vehicle. The destination are the outcomes that you're trying to get to. So you need to get the vehicle to work together with that. And I think if you're co-creating principles at the beginning of your project based on those purpose-based outcomes that you want to achieve that are beyond digital outputs, you can usually get your clients thinking about broader purpose, and accessibility and inclusion will usually come up. And if they need a nudge, you can come armed with data and insights about excluded groups that they need to think about and ask the hard questions. Is it really their intention to leave people out? I think it's part of our job as designers to help people understand, help people think more aspirationally, help clients think more aspirationally, and help them navigate this kind of complexity.
So there's the side where we're emphasising the kind of monetary gains and the transactional value of being accessible and inclusive, but then also I'm hearing the other side, which is talking and appealing to clients' values and doing it just because, as a thing in itself. Is there anything else, Ruth, you would like to add to that?
I think this is a really great question, Ella. It's something that lots of us will have faced at some point or other in our careers. And obviously, it would be great to align on values all the time, because in the ideal world, we're all working together to create inclusive products because it's the right thing to do. But that's not always practical, particularly for clients who've got competing pressures. So when I think about persuading people to create inclusive products, it's the same tactic that you use for persuading people to do anything, really, that they might not initially want to do. It's thinking, to Meena's point, what are the goals of the project beyond digital? How will inclusion help them achieve those outcomes? Who are the people in the organisation that you're talking to, and what do they value? How can you use what they value to encourage them to create inclusive products? And to help people understand the relationship between the digital goals and the real world goals, as we talked about. And sometimes you need to think about you want the people you're convincing to do the thing you want them to do. They don't necessarily need to know you were right. You just need to get them to create the inclusive products in the first place. And to some of the tactics we might use are, for example, like Emilia said, conversion or search engine optimization, discussing the percentage of an audience that we might be ignoring who might never convert. To give an example here, we're working with a university at the moment who are really fully behind making their website inclusive, which has been awesome and really heartening to see. They're really committed to utility and to taking a Tikanga-led approach. And to be really clear, they're taking this approach because it is the right thing to do. But one of the benefits of this, which we hadn't considered initially, came to light through our customer research. So by this university demonstrating that they're a place for tangata whenua and reflecting their commitment to Te Ao Māori through content and design, this meant that any international students, particularly non-white international students, perceive this university to be a really safe, non-racist place. So it makes them feel like they'll be included and they'll be welcome. This is likely to increase international enrollments as well. So by making products inclusive for one group of people, there's often a secondary benefit, sometimes benefits we might not even realize at the start of the project. So having those kind of examples can be a really powerful way of persuading people.
So they have like that knock-on effect, and actually how you treat and how you create for accessibility and inclusion, the whole kind of all your customers or people that you're trying to talk to are watching, and they're watching what you're doing, and that's kind of helping other people form opinions about your business.
Yeah, that's quite right. And it was really heartening to see that a lot of our clients do care about inclusion and accessibility. And to Meena's point, when they don't, it is our job to persuade them and to help them have those hard conversations as well.
Nice. Before I go on to another question that was asked, does anyone else have anything to add from that kind of values versus kind of outcomes argument?
I'll go ahead and say that while I agree, I think that when we're looking for that outcome of inclusion or accessibility, we may find ourselves in situations where we have to use rhetoric of different types to convince them. And whether that's business, commercial rhetoric, whether that's rhetoric around innovation, whether that's rhetoric around legal risk, these are all things we're saying to try and convince or translate the real need for accessibility into reasons that will speak to this other person or this organization. And I guess that's a necessity at certain points if we're looking for that outcome. But I find it frustrating that we need to provide those arguments. For example, SEO for years has been raised as one of the reasons to do accessibility online. It's increasingly not as true as if it ever was. But what happens if SEO no longer has any benefit when you do accessible design or development? Is the argument for accessibility then gone for that organization? Aren't we all saying, and isn't that the reason we've entrenched these values in things like the Human Rights Act and the Bill of Rights Act, that it is the right thing to do? That's why we're doing it. This is the kind of world we want to live in. We want to make sure that people with disabilities are part of that world. And so I guess all I'm doing is expressing my own personal consternation being caught between that the real reason I think inclusion and accessibility are important and why we think that, and then these arguments to get people who are resisting to come along. And I worry that sets up a problematic dynamic around the why of accessibility.
I think that's a really fair point, Jason, and it's really hard, isn't it, to sell the why of accessibility, which is really that it is the right thing to do. I mean, regardless of it being enshrined in law or not, alongside people who might be resistant to that for perhaps budgetary or time constraints. And I wonder if there's a way to weave those two stories together for best effect, and to have people ideally in-house, speaking from an agency perspective, in-house with clients who are able, like you, to sell the benefits and the real why behind doing accessibility and inclusion, along with people who are able to show those secondary benefits, and then weave those two stories together with the hope that eventually everyone understands why we should be doing it.
Yeah, that sounds like the right kind of approach to me. And I think, if we think about that kind of blending of those arguments, and we're looking for practical solutions, we start to think of technological approaches that we can leverage. So things like component systems or design systems or design pattern libraries. Certainly in a government context, something like an all of government design system where all the components are accessible, and you can rely on that. Having all government websites use that design system, for example, would solve a lot of that issue for us, and get those outcomes that we're looking for without even having to get into those arguments.
Although one would hope, though, also that over time, if we all as designers do our job, keep pushing this, along with a lot of other groups who push this agenda, that it will become more accepted. If you think of things like the right of women to vote or gay marriage, at one time they were this thing like, well, that's weird, or why would that happen? And now they're largely unquestioned. And so I hold out hope that if we all keep doing the weaving that Ruth is talking about, and things that that Jason and Emilia have brought up as well, that it will eventually become a thing that is not so much of a push. It's just expected by clients that that this is going to be part of what is going to be done.
And that also means that something everyone can do as well is you don't have to ask for an explicit agreement around accessibility. You can just make what you do accessible, inclusive. And that's where I think a lot of it can come from, because unless there are big legislative changes, it's not something that's going to come from the top. It's going to be coming from us sending mails to support at different companies saying, I cannot access the content. I feel excluded by the content. This does feel wrong to me. It also means during my practice, I want to make sure I do everything I can to make things accessible. And that's not necessarily cost me a lot of time, because it's going to cost at the beginning because you have to learn new things, and learning thing takes times. But once you get to a certain level, you know what to look for, when to look for it, and it becomes almost second nature to build things in a more inclusive manner to begin with, and not have to worry about, should I ask for it, and just make it so.
So it becomes natural and not an afterthought. And I think, yeah, everything's daunting to start with. Really great points. That kind of ties in to one of the other questions that was asked during submission. I understand that there's not really shortcuts we should be taking, but are there any software or apps you would recommend using to ensure your content online and your digital experiences online are more accessible and inclusive?
Do you want me to take the content part first, Ella?
Yeah, that would be great, thanks.
If we're speaking specifically about written content here, there are a few different digital tools you can choose. So, for example, some of our clients use a test called Fleisch-Kincaid test, which I can send you a link to in the chat in the tip. This can help you show the reading age of your content. And at Word, actually, weirdly, it's one of the things that Word does quite well. This is automated in a Word document. You can also use things like Cloze tests that help people understand. It shows how easy it is for people to understand your content. And I think the Hemingway app can help with this too. To be honest, though, there's really no substitute for actually testing your content with real users. So you could do this with remote unmoderated tests, like something like Chalkmark, which Optimal and Wellington produce, or in-person usability testing. Testing content with real people, even if it's just your colleagues, is definitely the best way to understand how accessible it is.
Thanks. And does anyone else have any general kind of software or apps that they have felt has helped them with their accessibility and inclusive journey that they'd like to add?
From a very technical perspective, I'm going to talk about Axe from Deque Systems. It's plugins for web browsers that allows you to find the biggest issues that pertains to accessibility. It's not a silver bullet by any means, but it helps avoiding the most obvious issues, which are surprisingly there in a lot of websites. It's very rare that even a small check like that does come up empty. On the point of content, I would like to add the self-defined app. It's a dictionary of definitions that was created by Tatiana Mac, who's the one behind the phrase I told earlier, intent does not erase impact. I'm going to leave a link in there as well.
Thanks.
And one last thing for people who are more bookish is Accessibility for Everyone by Laura Kalbag. It's a very good book that introduces a lot of the common mistakes you can make and how to alleviate them during your design process and building software.
Thanks for those recommendations. I'm definitely going to have a look at that book. Jason, is there anything else you'd like to add?
No, I would second all those recommendations. I would caution at the beginning, Ellie, you mentioned, are there any tools that people use to ensure the accessibility? And I would say that help ensure, because these sort of tools, they're hard to rely on 100%. Certainly in the content space, things like Fleisch-Kincaid and Hemingway. Those are really important tools to use. But a good Fleisch-Kincaid score doesn't necessarily represent a meaningful sentence. It's an indicator. You still need the expert content person to use that tool and their own expertise in tandem to decide if something is plain language, for example. And ACTS, wonderful suggestion. It's actually the rules that are in the ACTS tool are also in Google Lighthouse. So the Google Lighthouse tool actually runs the ACTS rules as part of that. And ACTS is really good, not only because it is available as a browser plugin, but it is also available as a free standalone JavaScript API that you can implement in your workflow. So developers can include the ACTS core library, and every time they make a commit to the repository, the ACTS rules will run against that bit of code. And if it discovers any accessibility issues, it will stop that commit and force the developer to fix it, which it tackles that bug at the earliest stage when it's cheapest to fix, and it forces the developer to learn some things, because the developer doesn't want to keep being hit with the same errors that they need to fix all the time. So there's a good educational component there. And finally, the reason that ACTS is really good is because barring any bugs in the software, it only reveals known accessibility bugs that it can find. In other words, it doesn't have any false positives. And historically, that's a big problem with automated accessibility tools, is that it flags thousands of potential errors that you need to go and manually review. And again, no developer wants to spend time doing that. So that's the nice thing about ACTS. There are some similar tools available out there. Tenon, TENON.io. That's another service. It's a server-based tool. It doesn't have a browser plugin, but it does have a website where you can put in a URL and it will check. But it also has a continuous integration service whereby, just like ACTS, when you're making commits, you can have them checked by Tenon and then have that stop your commit, and you can address those bugs when they're found. So both of those are really, really good. And they can get integrated with the developer's workflow. So they're really practical in that way. Other tools, I mean, there's lots. Color contrast analyzers are a big one. There are a number of those. There's no end of color contrast tools available. There are vision impairment simulators available for browsers. So plugins where you can see what your page is going to look like for someone with protanopia or deuteranopia, different types of color blindness, or people with floaters or astigmatisms or different types of visual impairments. But there are a lot of tools out there.
Thanks for that, Jason. Does anyone else have anything to add before we go into the Q&A section?
Yeah, just to wrap up on that, Ella, there are loads of tools out there, but there is absolutely no substitute for putting your product in front of real people to see how they use it. Because to Jason's point about the Fleisch-Kincaid test, you're quite right. You could have a web page full of things that said things like, the cat likes the dog likes the cat, highly readable, would pass the Fleisch-Kincaid test, completely meaningless and unusable. So putting it in front of real people is the way to just finally double check.
Absolutely.
Just a little segue there, away from accessibility. I just when Jason was talking about content and communications expertise, made me think about, I've often been working in content and communications, and get quite worried when we become the gatekeepers for expertise. So in the case that you're talking about, I fully agree. But there's some cases where it's not about the tool. It's where you decide to place your efforts as someone working in content or communication. So you might decide to curate a conversation rather than pushing out internally devised content. So an example of that was quite a few years ago now. The Ministry of Health approached us to create non-smoking messages for rangatahi. And it was like, oh, well, I'm not rangatahi. I think I was in my mid-30s. And so it's like, well, I don't know how they speak and how can we approach that? So the way that we did approach it was through a Twitter rap competition. And so the rangatahi themselves were putting together messages and then having conversations about it and that kind of thing. And so it's just interesting to think sometimes about maybe it's not the technology, maybe it's that you curate a conversation that is by nature more inclusive than broadcasting information.
That's a really good point, Meena. And to step away slightly from the tools, but to build on that, sometimes creating things that are inclusive can mean breaking your expectations around what best practice is. So there's an agency, Paper Giant, who are based in Melbourne, Australia, who are pretty amazing, actually. And they recently did a project to create a website for St Kilda, which is a suburb of Melbourne, the LGBTIQ legal service. And one of the things they did related to content is to put this module on the homepage that housed actually 10 different pride flags, including things like asexual, non-binary and intersex, as well as the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander flags. And it's quite unusual to have a module that takes up so much real estate on the homepage. And lots of people might think it pushes important content down. But what it does is it makes it really clear that this service is a really safe place for a variety of communities who might have felt excluded from those kind of services previously. So kind of breaking the mold around what UX best practices are can be really helpful around this. And then obviously testing that with users to make sure it fulfills the intent you think it's going to fulfill.
Thanks, Ruth. So it's like using kind of a bit of human intuition, which is great because it means machines can't take over all of our jobs.
I'm not being taken over by machines.
So if anyone has any questions, yep, Emilia.
I just wanted to add one last thing. It's very important to take a compassion-based approach where you need to trust the feedback you're given, even if that feedback may be uncomfortable because we're not used to receiving it, because we take it as a personal failure. It's important to accept that it may not always be comfortable to be inclusive, especially when we have lots of privilege. That means actually checking our privilege at certain points. And that's not necessarily comfortable. That's something that can be hard to come to terms with, but that's still something that's very necessary and something that everyone should do.
That's a really great point. Really resonates, kind of having uncomfortable conversations and giving people space to voice their opinions. Does anyone have any questions? I'd just like to open up to questions. If you do, please pop them in the chat. Let's have a look. So a question from Adele: what's the view on embedded text within video content, these using captions versus, sorry. Would anyone like to answer that?
So from a technical perspective, it's definitely a big no-no, because someone using a screen reader will not be able to actually read it. And that's something that's why you have captions. That's why you want to have transcripts on audio or video as well. It's because people may consume media differently than we do, and we have to include all these different ways. And within the video content means you have to be actually cited to enjoy that content.
Yeah, one of the team members shared a video from Twitter that we reposted showing how a short-sighted person visually impaired used her iPhone, and it was really insightful to watch. I didn't realise that there was, for example, like a Braille keyboard. So like thinking about how they were using their screen reader to go through and kind of listen to the kind of tweets and navigate around their phone. It was quite eye-opening to watch.
I'm curious about the question. Is the question about burned in or open captions versus closed captions? I'm just wondering what does embedded text within video content mean? I'm reading that as being captions that are embedded in the video. They're hard-coded in the video, or what we call open captions, because they're always there and you can't turn them off. And in that sense, there's not necessarily a big problem. There is a potential issue, like Emilia mentioned, if the captions are available as a separate caption file that is presented on top of the video as text, it's possible with some players for those captions to be announced by the screen reader. But that sets up an interesting situation, because a vision impaired person, unless they're deafblind or have a hearing impairment, they can typically hear the audio that's in the video clip. And so what they're missing usually for a vision impaired person is any important visual information. And that's why we have audio description, but as well, it's also why transcripts are also critically important, especially for people who are deafblind, in which case a text transcript, which is basically a text equivalent of all the meaningful audio and visual information in the video clip, can be read by a deafblind person who's using basically a screen reader to translate the content through a Braille display device. And they don't have access otherwise to any captions or any audio, and certainly not the visuals in the video. So in some cases, open versus closed captions is not a big deal. Sometimes open captions are even to be preferred. For example, if you're at a conference and you've got a television at a conference, at your booth at a conference, and you're showing a video, it'd be good to have the captions going all the time, because you likely have audio turned down. But I think what's more important is that you provide captions always, as well as a text transcript.
Kay Jones mentioned if captions cover a face, they can impede lip readers. So that's the point.
That's a good point. There are best practices for placement of captions, the length of a caption on a screen at one time. There's lots of good best practice guidance around that online.
I'm just kind of looking through the chat now. It looks like there's been lots of useful conversation. One person has popped in a quote from Matt May from Adobe. What we have are a few people who know a lot about accessibility. What we need are a lot of people to know a little bit about it. That's a great quote. Thank you for sharing that. If you've got any more questions, please pop them in the chat. I'm just having a look through. I'm still like, I love the quote that Emilia provided. Intent does not erase impact. I think that's a brilliant one. And yeah, does anyone have anything else that they would like to end the discussion with, end the discussion on a note?
I'd just like to say thanks to everyone who's here listening. It's really heartening to see that there are so many people interested in accessibility and inclusion. And to Jason's point earlier about taking a values-based approach, the more of us that are interested, the greater the chance we have of creating that argument and creating some real change and impact. So thank you everyone for listening.
And it was also great to see people actually having conversations in the chat, because obviously it doesn't need to be about all of us. So it was good to see things happening amongst people who worked in similar areas or who were facing similar issues.
We just had one more question from Adele. where do you even start making your content accessible, especially online? Maybe Ruth would like to deal with that first.
If I'm understanding the question correctly, do you mean, I'm going to have a weird voice to text conversation here. Adele, do you mean around your written content, how it's understandable, or do you mean how it's technically accessible? Both. Ooh, great question. All right, I'll talk to the written content part of it rather than the technical. Firstly, it's about understanding what do your customers want, who are they, what do they need, and what do they need to be able to do, and what's their preferred channel for participation. So it's about thinking of the customer journey holistically, not just thinking about the words you're going to write on the page. So, and this is a non-exhaustive list. Some of the things I would be thinking about are the language I was using. So is it inclusive? Does it make them feel welcome? Do they understand what they need to do? Then I'd be thinking about the channel choice. So is the website the right channel choice, or should we be offering non-digital experiences too? And then I would be testing the content that I thought fulfilled those needs with real customers, ideally firstly in just its written form, so you've got a bit more chance to refine it, but then also in the context of design to see how the UI elements and the content actually work together. What's the impression they give to these people? Does it meet their goals and needs? Does it make them feel welcome, included, and do they know what they need to do next? I hope that answers your question from the content perspective. I'm also happy to talk about this offline if you like. I can talk about inclusive content for quite a long time. I wonder if Emilia or Jason, you want to take the technical part of that?
You're on mute.
I added a couple of links. The one is the Web Accessibility Initiative from the W3C. They've got a bunch of great resources, introductory resources, resources explaining how different people with different disabilities use the web, some of the considerations around design and development for them. They have a whole bunch of tutorials, and they have some easy checks that anybody can do. So I would go there. If you have questions, I also posted a link to the WebAIM email discussion list, which is a long standing email discussion forum. And it's very active. If you have any question whatsoever about accessibility, web accessibility, post it there. It's very friendly, open, judgment-free, and the web accessibility experts that respond are top-notch. So you'll get really great feedback there from the WebAIM discussion list. And I see that Kaylin put in the accessibility project. That's another great one. They have a good checklist there. But I think if you're just starting out, those are the resources to start looking at from a technical perspective anyway.
Thanks for that. I think there was Matty Wilson touched on a point about, is there ever a reason that a stakeholder can demand the team to ignore best practice accessibility? I guess we kind of touched on that earlier in the sense of maybe sometimes accessible experiences don't necessarily have to follow best practice. But is there anything else that anyone would like to quickly add? Bearing in mind this is our last question before we wrap up. Emilia?
So ideally, everyone should make accessibility a core part of every web project they're working on. Sadly, that's not true at the moment. And also, if someone is telling you to willingly ignore accessibility, there's nothing actually telling you to follow that. And also, like I said, if you make things accessible by default, it's going to be accessible. You don't need to be loud and proud about it. You just do the work. And and also if you're talking about projects that have a legacy, you can't just stop the train and ask everyone to focus on that, because a business still has to run, still has to provide value to their customers. That means sometimes a balancing act between features and making things more accessible. There's a good point that I like in the development world, which is the scout rule of leave everything cleaner than you found it. So that can apply to accessibility as well. If you touch a part of a system that you know is not accessible, you can tweak it at the same time. It's not going to add much time to the actual effort you were going through, but every step counts and every step is making life better for someone else, and I think it's worth doing it.
Thank you for that. Thank you for that, Emilia. That's a great point to end on, that it doesn't have to be something daunting and to be put off and worried about. If you just take it step by step, you'll be making that difference to other people and other people's experiences on and offline. I'd just like to say thank you to all of our panelists for joining. Thank you for Kelly for supporting, and thank you for everyone who has had a really great conversation in the chat and has joined us today. This has been recorded, so we will publish it and let people know when that's online. And I hope you have a great day, and I hope you have a good rest of the Tech Week.
Thanks. Bye.
Bye.
Thanks, everyone.